Okay, let's unpack this. What if the end wasn't really the end? Not like spiritually, but physically. Just for a second.
Right. Imagine someone dies and then just boom, they're briefly back.
But not a ghost, not a zombie.
No, nothing like that. More like a physical echo. Pulled back, the sources say, by a single unfinished thought.
That idea is just
Yeah.
wild. And it's exactly what we're getting into in this deep dive. We're exploring this really strange historical phenomena.
Mm-hmm.
It's all described in this collection of writings and research notes called The Unfinished, Echoes of Final Thoughts.
And this material, it documents this whole period where people would apparently return right after death, but only for a moment.
Driven by a thought that death cut off midstream.
Exactly, like it was interrupted right at its peak intensity.
So our mission here is to pull out the key insights from these sources for you. We want to explore what they reveal about this whole thing, the theory behind it, the global reaction, the impact, and the questions, right? The big questions it left behind.
Yeah, we're digging into the core knowledge here.
Yeah, because like you said, these weren't spirits.
No, the sources really hammer that point home. They were described more as fleeting fragments of people, just drawn back for that instant by the sheer force of an unresolved idea or purpose.
Okay, let's jump right in then. How do the sources actually define the unfinished? What's the basic phenomenon?
So in essence, it's individuals confirmed dead who then briefly return just to complete a specific thought, a thought they were having at the moment of death.
It sounds completely impossible.
It does, but the accounts in this collection are pretty extensive.
And you said the sources are adamant they weren't supernatural.
Absolutely adamant. Not ghosts, not spirits, not reanimations. They were seen as physical manifestations, fragments pulled back only by what the researchers called unresolved cognition.
Unresolved cognition, like a thought process cut short.
Yeah, especially a powerful one, a purpose, a realization, something significant right at that transition point.
Okay, that idea of unresolved cognition seems central. Can you give us a couple of the early examples the sources used to illustrate this?
Sure. One case they mention a lot is this woman declared brain dead after a really bad accident.
Okay.
The sources say she suddenly sat up in the morgue just long enough to ask, but what if the dog got out through the back gate,
And
then collapsed again? Permanently, it seems.
wow, just the everyday nature of some of these thoughts is almost creepier than the return itself.
It really is. Another one from the collection describes a soldier killed in combat. Hours later, the reports claim he just briefly stood up among the recovery team,
And said,
muttered, "I forgot to tell Sarah where the key is," and then immediately fell back down, gone again.
and the typical duration for these returns? What does the material say?
Incredibly short, usually just moments. Just enough time for a phrase, maybe a single sentence, and then gone. Forever, in the physical sense.
So this is happening.
Mm-hmm.
People must have been desperate for an explanation. Did the sources propose any kind of theory, even a speculative one?
They did. The main working theory, discussed quite a bit in the material, is called cognitive momentum.
Cognitive momentum. Okay, what's the idea there?
The concept, as laid out in the research notes, is that certain thoughts, when interrupted by death, especially thoughts tied to like an unfinished purpose or a really significant realization happening right then,
Yeah.
they create enough psychic inertia, that's the term they use, to briefly pull the mind back into the physical body.
Almost like snapping a rubber band, a recoil.
Sort of, yeah. And the sources contrast, minor thoughts, forgetting password, a small regret, with the big ones, the ones that seem to generate this momentum.
Like a final critical realization or remembering something vital.
Exactly. Or a deep, unfulfilled task. Things with weight.
There's that quote from Dr. Ramos, one of the researchers mentioned in the collection. It really sums it up.
Which one?
Purpose is a gravitational force. Left incomplete, it pulls the mind back through death itself.
Yeah, that one really captures the essence of the theory they were working with. It puts the focus squarely on the internal state, the intensity of the unfinished thought.
Okay, so the theory is out there. These brief returns are happening. How did the world even cope? Governments, societies? It must have been chaos.
It caused huge disruption. And the sources detail a pretty major governmental response. They talk about setting up something called the Registry of Final Thoughts.
A global registry. Wait, how could they even collect data on something so fast and random?
Well, the methods were intrusive, and they evolved. The material mentions hospitals putting neural recording bands on patients on life support.
Wow.
In war zones, soldiers apparently got microsync implants as standard issue, and maybe the most striking. Airlines reportedly required passengers to sign waivers, allowing thought capture tech if they died mid-flight.
That's intense. And the sources say this wasn't primarily about safety.
No, surprisingly. The stated goal, according to these documents, was clarity, trying to reduce the public panic, the chaos these sudden appearances cause.
And maybe offer some kind of final message.
Exactly, a potential final word for grieving families, however fragmented it might be.
Though the sources admit the data wasn't always reliable. But it offered some hope for closure, maybe.
Glimpses, yeah. And the examples recorded in the sources are all over the place. Some are weirdly mundane, like, I forgot the lasagna in the oven.
Seriously.
Seriously. Others were incredibly personal. She was the one, not Melissa. And then you got the really unsettling ones, like, don't let them open the vault.
And the impact of these messages, equally unpredictable, the sources suggest.
Totally. Some apparently saved lives, gave crucial warnings. Others, well, reportedly ruined lives. Secrets coming out at the worst possible moment.
So most returns were just these brief flickers. But the source material also talks about some really unusual, prolonged cases, right?
Yes, and this is where it gets even stranger. The outliers.
The ones that weren't just seconds long.
Exactly.
Hmm.
The first person described as a prolonged unfinished was Aaliyah Reyes. Her story is a major focus in the collection.
She died in that huge freeway collapse in California, didn't she?
Yeah.
Vital signs gone.
Confirmed dead. But minutes later, the accounts say amidst the wreckage, she just sat up.
And delivered her returning thought.
It wasn't just a weak spot in the road, it was engineered.
Whoa. But unlike the others, she didn't just collapse again.
No. She blinked, stood up, and kept talking.
She became the first prolonged unfinished.
Right. The sources suggest her final thought, maybe its scale, the depth of conviction, somehow anchored her, kept her in that state.
That must have caused panic.
Oh, absolutely. Documented panic among authorities. She was quickly sequestered, studied intensely. But her statement never changed. She kept insisting these structural failures worldwide weren't accidents. They were tests. Deliberate.
Engineered tests. And then there was an even more astounding case mentioned. Franklin Vale.
Franklin Vale.
Yeah.
Described as the first, and so far the only known, eternal unfinished.
Eternal.
He died of cardiac arrest on a train in New York, confirmed dead, body prepped for removal.
And then?
18 minutes later, the sources say he just stood up in the train car and announced his returning thought. I know how to fix the world.
Okay, but the eternal part.
He just kept talking. According to the material, he has been talking for 3 years now, housed in a Vermont observatory.
Doing what?
Apparently trying to articulate, quote, the equation that ends suffering. But never quite getting there, just this continuous stream of thought.
And people listen.
Oh, yes. He has followers. They see him as a living oracle. They diligently record everything he says in something called the Mind Wave Codex.
3 years compared to a few seconds. That just completely changes the game, doesn't it? It forces you to question what thought even is.
Absolutely. The sources imply that's exactly what started happening. People fundamentally rethinking consciousness.
These prolonged cases were rare, though. The sources also mention other types of returns. Less dramatic, maybe, but just as fascinating. And the research they inspired.
Definitely. There's the story of Eli Turner, the quiet man from Nova Scotia.
Tell me about him.
Eli, the notes say, died peacefully from ALS and hospice care. Standard death. But minutes later, he gasped, came back briefly.
And whispered.
It's not over. Then he looked into the empty space beside his bed, smiled, and added, she's still here.
His wife.
His wife, yeah, who had died years earlier. The sources mention the security feed showed him smiling at what looked like empty air. Then he died again, seconds later.
That's incredibly poignant. Not prophecy, the sources say, but maybe a reunion.
That was the interpretation. A brief, powerful, personal moment.
And what about the scientific response? People trying to induce this.
Right. That brings us to Dr. Mina Vell, a cognitive neuroscientist who became, well, obsessed with intentionally triggering a return. Her research was called entrails.
Her goal was to come back just long enough to finish her own work, wasn't it? Something
The bridge is between language and perception. That was the phrase she focused on, according to her notes.
And she took extreme steps.
Very extreme. The sources detail her voluntary euthanasia under intense medical and biomonitoring. They were trying to capture everything.
Did it work? Did she return?
She did. She sat up, started the phrase, the bridge, then she paused. The account says she looked down at her own hands, really looked at them, smiled, and finished the sentence differently. Isn't needed anymore.
Isn't needed anymore. What did that mean?
Nobody knows. She died right after saying it. And adding to the mystery, her journals reportedly burned in an unexplained fire just 2 days later, all her research notes gone.
Just another puzzle left behind.
Exactly. And all these individual stories, the brief ones, the long ones, the strange ones, they all fed into this massive global effort to make sense of it all.
Which led to that UN initiative, the Cognitive Terminal Archive.
That's right, a huge centralized database. The goal was to log every single documented post-mortem phrase uttered by any unfinished, anywhere in the world.
The sheer volume must have been staggering. The sources list examples from everywhere.
Just incredible variety. The baby's not mine from Germany. The stars are watching from Kenya. Don't touch the red folder. Japan. I forgive you, Dad. Brazil. He's inside the wall. Texas. Thousands and thousands.
And researchers dug into this archive hoping for
Pattern.
answers.
That was the hope. Connections across cultures, geography, maybe some grand underlying message. But the sources say they found nothing clear, no obvious links.
But they did notice something else, something unsettling.
Yeah. The fragments weren't just random noise. Over time, they seemed to be growing, and some started repeating, overlapping.
Which led to the Synapse Convergence.
Exactly. This bizarre phenomenon described in the sources where people worldwide dying from totally unrelated causes, accidents, illness, old age, didn't matter, started returning with the exact same phrase.
Which was,
The system is not
the
closed.
system is not closed. That's chilling. What system closed how? It must have terrified people.
It sparked everything from pure panic to intense religious speculation. What did it mean?
And Alia Reyes, the prolonged unfinished, she had an interpretation.
She did. Still under observation, when they told her about this convergence, her reported response was, they're getting closer.
They? Who are they?
When they pressed her, she apparently said, the ones who started the thought. And when asked what thought, she just said, the one we're all still in.
Wow. That's deeply philosophical, almost reality-bending.
A truly disturbing perspective on whatever was happening.
So this whole phenomenon, it must have completely shaken up belief systems everywhere.
Absolutely. The sources talk about new cults, new religions popping up, all centered around these final thoughts, treating them like divine truth, revelations. They called them the echoes.
So Alia's phrase, it was engineered, that became actual doctrine for some.
In one group, yes. And Franklin Vale, still talking in his observatory, was basically seen as a living oracle by his followers, carefully writing down his every word in that mindwave codex.
But alongside the belief, there was fear.
A lot of fear. Fear that death wasn't final. Fear that thought itself was this incredibly powerful force, maybe more powerful than life or death.
And this mix of fear and fascination, it led to some pretty radical movements, like the completionists.
Right. This group believed you could actually design thoughts, structure them in life so that your mind could consciously return after death. Not just reflexively, but intentionally, maybe to bring back information from somewhere else.
How did they even try that?
They recruited volunteers who were already dying, philosophers, mathematicians, people used to intense abstract thought. The idea was to push cognition to the absolute limit right at the end, hoping it would create a kind of loop.
There would work.
The sources indicate very limited success. Only a few of their volunteers returned at all, and most didn't say anything that made sense.
But there was one case. Subject Zeta.
Subject Zeta, an anonymous volunteer in one of the completionist facilities, died under observation, 14 minutes later returned.
And said,
Reportedly said, the idea is alive.
the idea is alive.
Yeah, and when the observers, stunned, managed to ask where, the reply was, in you.
In you, okay. And then, did he just die again like the others?
No, that's the truly bizarre part. According to the sources, Subject Zeta vanished. Didn't collapse, didn't die again. Just gone.
Vanished. The sources offer no explanation.
None whatsoever. A complete anomaly. An utter mystery.
It's incredible that after all this whole era, the time of the unfinished, it didn't actually last.
No. The material notes that around 2042, the number of documented returns started to drop off significantly.
Fewer and fewer people came down.
Fewer and fewer until, eventually, none. It just stopped. The phenomenon seemed to fade away.
Scientists at the time must have been baffled, maybe scared.
The sources mention scientific fear, yeah. Fear that whatever connection allowed this, whatever strange bridge led a thought loop back, had just dissolved, broken.
And then came the very last one. The last return.
The final documented instance in the collection, Franklin Vale, the eternal unfinished, still talking after all those years in the observatory. He paused mid-sentence.
After years of nonstop talking.
Yes. The sources describe him looking up, almost surprised, tears in his eyes, and he whispered, I feel it.
What did he feel? did he say?
His followers asked him, and he just smiled, apparently, and said, "It's finished." Then he lay down and died. Permanently this time.
And that, according to these incredible sources, was the definitive end. The end of the thought era.
So where does that leave us? We've gone deep into these sources, exploring the unfinished phenomenon.
We looked at those first brief, fleeting returns.
The baffling, prolonged cases like Alia Reyes, the seemingly endless stream from Franklin Vale.
Quiet personal moments like Eli Turner's reunion, and those strange, deliberate attempts like Dr. Vell's.
We saw how governments tried to track it all with registries and archives, how researchers hunted for patterns.
Only to find that chilling synapse convergence. Different minds, same unsettling thought. The system is not closed.
And we touched on the fear it generated, the new beliefs it sparked, even those audacious completionists trying to harness thought beyond death itself.
Now, according to these sources, that era's over. The return stopped. Franklin Vale said, "It's finished."
But the writing suggests something lingers, echoes, and the final thought the sources leave us with is potent. It resonates beyond just the history.
Why should you, listening now, care about this maybe fictional, maybe historical account?
Because the story, as told here, leaves us grappling with a really fundamental question. One they say still gets whispered sometimes, maybe in dreams, maybe by kids born after it all ended.
Is thought just
Yeah.
brain activity, synapses firing? Or is it something more?
Is it a tunnel, a loop, a kind of whisper through? Something else? Time? Reality?
And maybe, just maybe, you're not done yet.
Something to think about.
Until our next deep dive.